Hello everybody. So back again, Mr. Sarkos, Research Methods. We continue on with module number 5. In our last class, we wrapped up the identification of variables, what they are, and how we measure them, and the importance, therefore, of operational definitions. There are ways to measure in a consistent way these variables that are part of our study. Now, we reach the step of the scientific data. Now that we have a theory, we've predicted with a hypothesis that is testable, that is falsifiable, then this third step would be to collect the data. And this is where the research methods topic is, this is where it concentrates. This is where it can vary depending on your hypothesis, depending on your research question. You choose the method that fits best to your purpose of the study, which is to answer that research question. There are many ways to collect data across the social sciences and, in fact, within psychology. But the main ones that are used are described in your textbook, and hopefully following my suggestions you are listening to this screencast after taking notes and revising again the information provided by your textbook. There are several ways again to collect data. The ones we'll review throughout this unit are descriptive methods, and which are right here, and correlational. Studies also collect data in a different way for a different purpose, and the experiment is another design. All of these are also designs, as I just said. Within the descriptive methods, we have 3 different types or subtypes, and these are the case study and naturalistic observation, and surveys, which include interviews as we explained in class. Descriptive methods are those that, and I know at the sake of sounding circular with this definition, are when we want to describe what is occurring. Now, we have a very basic definition of what it is to describe, is to basically see the phenomenon. This reminds me a little bit about Francis Bacon and his suggestion that the best way to answer questions, remember the jackass question, how many teeth does a jackass have? He would say, well, go and observe it yourself, go and experience it yourself, and do the counting on your own instead of listening to an authority, in that case the Pope, being him influenced by Catholicism, which was one of the ideologies that dominated Europe at the time. So again, keep in mind the question on your slide, which is how do psychologists use case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, and other methods to observe, measure, and describe behaviors. In your textbook, you have these definitions at the very end of Module 5. However, after reading it and studying it again, I think that it deserves, I think you guys are going to be better off if they're explained right now before we go into the different descriptive methods and methods in general. Why? Because these methods are going to vary depending many times or frequently on these definitions. And this is going to make more sense as we go through them. These concepts, to which, again, as I wrote on the Google Classroom, you need to have a very, very clear, specific definition, understanding of these concepts, because there are going to be many questions on your test, both on our unit test and on the AP exam, that will require you to really think of these terms in a quick and efficient manner. So make sure you know what a population is, what a sample is, what a random sample is, or random sampling as a process to obtain a random sample, representativeness. I can't believe I said that correctly. Well, maybe, I don't know. And then within this concept, we have 2 sub-concepts. We have a representative sample and a non-representative sample. and generalizability. Wow, I said it. Yeah, so make sure you have these concepts and the differences and similarities between them. We begin with population and sample. Especially with population, it's important to know that we use this term in our everyday lives very differently. Well, not very differently, but we use it differently in psychological research than how we use it in our everyday lives, as I said. Usually, in our everyday vocabulary, we refer to population about usually in geographical terms or parameters. You know, the total population of New York is the total population in the United States. And two things here. Usually, psychology does not intend to study or know something about the entire population. Usually, psychologists are very specific about an age group they wish to compare with another age group, gender, and usually within gender there are age limitations or age parameters. And what I'm trying to say here is that usually it's very rare that we want to know the attitudes of every single American, be it a baby, be it somebody who's 120 years old. We want to know the attitude of everybody, or we wish to measure a particular behavior of everybody because it varies so much within these parameters. So again, population is what the group we want to know about, and the thing is, you know, even let's say my population are. I wish to study the attitude of poly-prep students towards the new dress code. Well, what is my population? Give you a chance to think there for a bit. Poly-prep students. If I wish to know what poly seniors think about drug use. And if that would be my population, poly seniors. Now, even with that more restrictive concept of population that we use in research, it's close to impossible or next to impossible to interview, to observe, to describe everybody within even that population, right? So the good news is that we don't have to. In order to know something, a particular behavior across a particular, all members in a population, we don't have to. That's why we have a sample. And a sample is a subset of that population, basically a group within that big group. I want you to keep in mind two things about samples. And these are, first of all, size matters when it comes to samples. Second, we want a sample that is representative. If it's not a representative sample, we don't want it. We're not going to do anything good about it, with it, sorry. And from these two characteristics, we're aiming for, essentially, a representative sample. And then the larger the sample, referring to the size matters point, is that the larger the sample, the more the likelihood is greater of this sample being representative. So again, we're aiming for a representative sample. That's what we want in our study. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to do anything beyond that. And if the larger the sample, our chances of having that representative sample will increase. Now, why do we want a representative sample? Well, if our research question involves, let's say, let's go with, let's say I want to measure let's say I'm interested in studying the difference between the attitude New York independent school students have, high schoolers have, their attitude towards the legalization of marijuana, and compare it to public school high schoolers, right? So what is my population here? My population are, well, I actually have two populations, and I have, one population is independent school students from New York that go to school in New York, in independent schools in New York, and I have another population, which is the public school students in New York. So I want a sample of each group because it's going to be just too expensive, it's going to take too long, and it's going to require too much effort on already, overstressed Mr. Sarkos. And I want to have a sample that is representative of these two groups. Now, this might sound redundant, but just in case, I want my sample to be representative because my true intention is to study the population. I don't care about studying the sample. The sample is, it's not important to me. But I want to know the attitude across the board and then compare between independent school students in New York and independent school students in public school students. So I want my sample to tell me what the larger group thinks. And in order for me to have an accurate depiction of what the population thinks, which is my goal again, I can't repeat it enough, I want my sample to look as similarly as possible to that population. I want it to represent most accurately as possible that population that is of my interest. And this is what we call generalizability, by the way. I know in class we spoke about generalization, but actually the term is generalizability. The extent to which I can take the results of my sample, right, and say, well, this sample has a very strong, let's say, positive attitude towards the legalization of marijuana, right, in my study. Again, the sample per se is not of my interest. I want to know what all students think about it. So my population, right? So to what extent what my sample thinks about the legalization of marijuana is the same, or at least close to being the same, as what the population thinks. This is what we call the generalizability of my sample. In this case, the generalizability, the ability to say, okay, my sample thinks this way, therefore my population thinks this way. So I can generalize it to the rest of the population. I can say based on the sample, my population thinks the same way. So as you can see, the generalizability, that extent to which we can apply the results or use the results of our sample, of our study, and say the rest of the population thinks similarly, you can see how they go hand in hand. Generalizability depends on to what extent the group represents the population. So they basically work together. So is my sample representative? Yes. Okay, so then that means that it is very likely, almost guaranteed, that I'm going to be able to generalize the results that I find. I'll generalize my results from the sample to the rest of the population. Why? Because my sample is representative of the population. The question now is, how do we do this? How do we obtain a representative sample? I already said that with the slide that size matters, meaning that the larger the sample, the probabilities are greater. But still, size will not guarantee that my sample is representative. So the best way, and perhaps the only way, to obtain a representative sample, actually it's not the only way, but we can't go into the types of sampling. It depends a lot on our hypotheses. If you take, in fact, I don't think, maybe a research class, yeah, I think a research class in college would go into the types of sampling. But for the purpose of this class, the best way, the only way of obtaining, or at least knowing that you're very close to obtaining a representative sample, is having a random sample. It's good to draw all these, as you go, to draw a chart, like, oh, this means a representative sample will allow me to have a high generalizability, and the only way to do this, I don't know, it's an idea that occurs to me as I would be confused. Yes, so the only way, for the purpose of this unit in this class, to have a representative sample, a sample from which we can generalize the results to the rest of the population, sorry that I'm repeating that a lot, but I just wanted to ingrain it in your minds, is to have a random sample. And a random sample is very, very simple to understand. A random sample is, as your slide says, one in which every single member of the population we intend to know more about, right? All the members of that population have an equal chance of being selected. So the typical example they use is drawing numbers from a hat, or as you see in the picture, like lottery. The way these machines are built are that, again, in order to have this legal prestige, right, lotteries, they need to make sure, and people certify that these machines are selecting these lottery balls randomly. So again, that all of these, in this case in lotteries, that all of these have an equal chance of being selected. So it's going to be by pure chance that you're going to select in research one member or another. So again, if going back to this study, I want to know the attitude of students towards the legalization of marijuana, if they have a positive or a negative attitude towards it, and then compare it to public school students. If first I'm measuring the independent school students in New York, then I need to perhaps have a list of all, or input the list the way they do it these days, because there are many random generators online or in a computer. Usually they use a sophisticated software program, but in which I will input. Perhaps I go to all the independent schools in New York, and I get the names of all the students, and then I'm going to input it in a program, or I assign. The way I think they do it is they assign every student a number, and then you input all this data in the software, and then voila, you get a random selection of, let's say you want a sample of 100, or you need a sample of 100 students, then it's going to select. But all of you as independent students, you're going to have an equal chance of being selected for my survey, as well as students from other independent schools in New York. Again, I want my sample to be random. Why? Because I want a representative sample. Why? Because I want to generalize the results I obtain from studying this sample. And I want to generalize these results to the rest of the population. Say, well, if my sample says strongly, they have a strong positive attitude, that means that my population, which is my main interest of the study, has the same or very similar. What we don't want is a non-representative sample. The illustration can depict very accurately for those visual learners out there what a non-representative sample could look like, right? Or let's say, this is our population, this is the group we want to study, and this is our sample. Well, this is leaving out people that for some are, that are representative of the population, but we're leaving it out. So we're not knowing their opinion. Therefore, we're just, we're on the path to inaccuracy. And this is a big controversy in psychology. Most of the studies that we will, journals that we will read are very useful and have basically changed the world of psychology, and a lot of hard work is put into it. But one of the points, or one of the criticisms of psychology studies is that they come from college students taking an intro to psych class. So if the intention, which I doubt, is to study students in the U.S., college students that are from 18 to 21 years old taking an intro to class, that's not the population intended to study, right? They want a sort of a more flexible generalization, a population that is more interesting to know about, right? And as you can see, by selecting only college students, because what happens is, guys, but you won't go through this because you're going to get a 5 on your AP exam, and you will get credit for your intro to psych course. But what happens is that college students taking an intro course need to, most universities, need to participate in an experiment in order to, as a requirement for that class. So basically you sign up based on your schedule and your interest, and you go and participate in the study, boom, you get credit, and you fill that requirement. But if you think about it, are these results really generalizable to the rest of the population, whatever it is? Perhaps it's young people from 8 to 21 years old, and their attitude on, I don't know, on anything about interpersonal relationships or about any psychological phenomena. And can we generalize those results? Is that sample, being selected within the universities and colleges, is that sample really representative? Can we generalize the conclusions of such studies to the rest of the population? To the, say that we can, these cases are similar to the population that includes students that don't go to college, can't afford college, or it's very, again, it's a controversial topic that still comes up in psychological research. In 1936, the magazine Reader's Digest conducted a survey in which they sent out 2 million postcards. No, I believe I think they sent more than that. And they received 2 million responses. And of their responses, 57% said, which is pretty high margin for this candidate, 57% said that they would vote for Alf Landon. In fact, excuse my ignorance, I didn't know who Alf Landon was. But again, I'm not a specialist in American history, U.S. history, or APUSH, however you call it. Anyway, got carried away there for a minute. So they 57% says that they're going to vote for Alf Landon, and of course, we know that he didn't win. There's a reason why. I don't know who he is. I think I wouldn't know if he had he won the elections. And who wins instead of Alf Landon? But who wins? And that's a name we are familiar with, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And not only did the other candidate win, this is referring to Reader's Digest survey, he wins by a lot. He wins by a great margin. So what went wrong here? And because this was a huge thing, there was a lot of money being invested in this survey. Before this, I believe there was a very precarious system, more based on just common sense and intuition, predicting who the next president would be. And what went wrong, it can be basically explained with one word, and that's sampling bias or sampling error, in which our sample does not represent the attitude to vote, in this case, the intention to vote of the population we were interested in studying. Because ultimately, the intention to vote of the sample itself, we're not interested in so much, because who's going to vote? The entire population that we wish to study, right? Because we want to know who the next president will be. And so, yes, the short answer is sampling bias. But think about this. Where did this bias come from, and how which is the important reason for this example, is that what was happening in the U.S. in 1936? You're correct if you guessed the Great Depression. And the responses, how did they get all these names in order to select... They were selecting the names of the survey they were selecting the names, in phone books and in automobile registrations. Now, I'd like to highlight those two things, where they were getting these surveys from. And in 1936, think about the people who had phones and who had automobiles, who had cars. I don't know why I'm talking as if I was in 1936. People that had a certain socioeconomic status. Buying a car was very expensive. Buying a phone was not as expensive, but still it was a luxury at the time. And the poor were voting Democrat, or are voting Democrat, at this time. But yes, the poor were voting very, very defining. I was about to say a word that doesn't exist, but there was a clear definition of the poor's intention to vote for Democrats. And they were left out of the sample. Therefore, the sample that said that Landon would win was not representative. And obviously, the results could not be, or the conclusions could not be generalized to the population. And that led to inaccuracy, which was Landon did not win. Who won was Franklin D. Roosevelt. So now that we have those concepts out of the way, let's go into the methods within the descriptive methods of all these designs that psychologists use to study phenomena. So we begin with case studies. We begin talking about this in both sections, but doesn't hurt to review. It's an in-depth study of one individual, a group, or a particular situation too. And when we talk about situations, you might be saying, well, how can we study a particular situation? Well, we're still going to be observing people, but people who went through a particular event. Perhaps themselves don't have a particular condition. It's just that they've lived through an event. And we want to study how this population was affected. I am sure that I've come across many studies in which psychologists have followed throughout time and with great detail groups of people that were in the buildings during 9/11 to sort of answer their research question as to the repercussions of people who go through a trauma of that kind. Again, it's an extreme circumstance in which we can learn a lot for the rest of the population. But again, it's a very particular group. And perhaps from knowing some extreme cases of stress or post-traumatic stress, we can better understand either people that are healthy and can be exposed to particular stress, maybe perhaps developed a prevention program, or people that have not extreme cases of post-traumatic stress. But again, by knowing how bad it can get or how intense a particular phenomenon can get, we know better realities that are not that extreme. Examples I gave in class, and I'll post on Google Classroom, are Phineas Gage, Jeannie the Wild Child. I think for one section we didn't talk about her. Jeannie was I always forget her case in detail, but from what I understand, from what I remember, Jeannie was this girl who was abused severely by her parents as they had her completely isolated from society. Very sad story. She was tied against the bed for much time. She didn't learn how to walk or speak until she was 13, and I believe that was a pretty traumatic process. But again, to study, again, this is a very extreme case that would allow psychologists to better understand and answer questions to perhaps kids that suffer abuse, but in more moderate ways. Although, to say moderate when it comes to abuse of children, is kind of difficult to say. But you get the idea that this is an extreme case that went on for many years, and therefore it would give some insight as to how child abuse can be either prevented or treated in cases that are not as severe. And then I also showed in the section 1, I showed a clip of the film Nell, which is basically the story about, I believe they're a couple, Liam Neeson and I forget her name, but Jodie Foster is a child similar to Jeannie, but I don't think she was just left there because of abuse. I just think that, I forget, I watched that film a long time ago. I was a freshman in college. So she lives basically in the nature, and she doesn't know how to communicate with words, but she can, it's a great film, and Jodie Foster delivers, as she normally does, a great interpretation of the role. But that film is about, you can check it out on YouTube, just, the trailer, I showed it to the other section, but that's a movie about a case study. Again, I told you to think about these 3 methods, and all the methods we're going to study, about when should we use them, but also what are the positives and are the negatives, which basically tell us when, depending on our research question, which are the ones that suit our pursuit best. The positives of case studies, as we discuss in class, is that they provide us with a lot of information. You're following somebody in great detail, and sometimes they live with the people that they are going to be observing, right? So this is going to logically provide the researcher with a great amount of detail, high amount of information, and case studies are also great because when you observe people, and this hopefully we'll be able to do in class because you're being very diligent with this screencast, is when you observe people, you might not have a question at the time, but by just observing, you all of a sudden questions pop in your head and say, oh, I'm interested in this, and this could be a good research question. Hopefully that'll be our case when we try and do this at Poly Campus. Some of you told me that in creative writer's life class, you did a similar exercise, and that you found it actually pretty interesting. I know it doesn't sound very appealing just by explaining it. And then the negatives are that, imagine, I mean, following somebody for days in terms of resources, time, effort, energy is taxing. Or studying, again, one case. This is why I wanted to know, I wanted that you know these concepts beforehand, is that case studies, the potential for representativeness and the ability to generalize the results to the population we're interested in studying is very low. And it's very prone to experiment or biases. Usually a case study is done by 1 or 2 researchers. So what do you think can happen there? If you already have an idea of a research question and you're following and investing all this effort, you're prone to confirmation bias. That's why it's important to have a good coding sheet for the class that we had the opportunity to see that coding sheet for friends and identifying friendship rituals. You need to have a very structured and very well-designed tool that can control a little bit for confirmation bias, which can be an experimenter bias, you know. Think about PhD students. They need to work years on a dissertation, and as much as they say that it's okay to you know, for your evidence to support the null hypothesis, the opposite of what you're saying in your hypothesis, it means a big deal. So it's that situation. Dissertations are very prone to confirmation bias. The other method I'll talk about is naturalistic observation. Very clear with its title. And the benefit of naturalistic observation is that we observe behavior as it is. Jane Goodall, I'm sure you've heard of her. If you haven't, it's important to know about Jane Goodall. She observed chimpanzees, and for a long time there's a movie about her. And Mr. Sivan, by the way, he has a daughter whose second name, don't tell him I forgot, Lila Jane, I believe her name is. Well, her middle name is is in honor of Jane Goodall. And she was a comparative, I believe she was a comparative psychologist or a zoologist. I don't remember exactly, but if she was, I believe she was a comparative psychologist, maybe, or in that similar field. Anyway, she observed the behavior of chimpanzees to better understand human behavior, and she found out some very interesting things that don't come to mind right now about empathy and motivation. I'm not unclear about that right now. But naturalistic observation is usually the researcher it goes undercover. And, you know, it's a little comical because it's basically what stalkers do, or, you know, and must feel very uncomfortable. But again, why do researchers do this? Because you don't want to interfere with the behavior of people. You want to prevent what, we're going to talk about this later on, but you want to prevent something, just to give you an idea, something that's called the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect explains something very simple, that we behave differently when people are watching us. This comes from a study done in the 40s, I believe, in some factories. The Hawthorne was a name or part of the name of these factories, and they wanted to study employee productivity, and they had people, to see if people worked better in settings that had, strong lighting or sort of more dim lighting. And they found out that workers there was no difference, but not because lighting didn't have an effect. It was because they were being observed. Just by the mere fact that they knew that they were being observed, they worked harder. So this idea of being undercover in naturalistic observation is because you want to avoid the Hawthorne effect. You don't want people that you're observing, the population or the sample that you're studying, to behave differently Why? Because of the Hawthorne effect, or the possibilities of them behaving differently in that context. Again, we go back to the pros and cons. Naturalistic observation, you get to observe, you get to see the real deal of behavior. Meaning, and this goes hand in hand with low artificiality, and that's a term that, although I mispronounce it, that it's important to know the level of artificiality that each methods has. And the negatives are that you have little control. Think about it. What if somebody does at least become suspicious that somebody is observing them? You know, we get that sense sometimes without being paranoid, and people are going to behave differently, and you know, you might get into even trouble if this is happening. It's also prone to experiments or biases. Same thing, confirmation bias. You have an idea, and to what extent can you control that you are going to observe? Remember, confirmation bias is not only seeing and observing and recording what you want to see, it's also neglecting what perhaps is contradictory to your belief or your hypothesis. There's low generalizability. Why is that? I don't know. I'm not sure if results are low in terms of generalizable. I'll get back to you on that. For now, forget it. That might have been just a typo on my part. The last one of these 3 descriptive methods is the survey. And remember, as I explained in class, survey includes interviews. I clarify this because we immediately think about a piece of paper that we have to fill out. And yes, it is the most common way, and we're gonna see why. But surveys include interviews too. I mean, an interview is a form of a survey. And as the slide indicates, it's a series of questions. And very, very important, guys. This is, you know, mad lit-G important that you use surveys to examine or study or measure attitudes and beliefs. At the very beginning of our course, we clarified that these are mental processes, right? So because we cannot observe them in an empirical sense, we ask people to self-report, to describe how they feel about something or about somebody or about anything. So surveys, we rely on people's self-report because we, you know, what other way can we observe an attitude, right? And that's precisely why they can be limiting, and we'll see that as well. So these are normally done over the phone, although I never answer surveys over the phone because they're just, we don't have time to do that here in New York. After the internet, most of them are done this way, and it has been studied. There is strong evidence. I was going to say it has been proven, but I'm not going to say that. Wait a minute, just said it, but you know what I'm trying to illustrate here and to highlight. But electronic surveys, meaning those done by the internet, are most effective. They're easy, and we consider them, of the options, the most private one. And I'll explain why that is relevant too. And they can take different forms. They can be structured where each question has a scale or a yes or no, and it's very easy to quantify. Or they can have an unstructured one, which means basically surveys that have open-ended questions, and there are no limitations in terms of characters or time talking and answering to these questions. The positives and negatives, the strong positive about surveys is that they are very easy in terms of, I shouldn't say easy, but they're I'll just go what the slide says, and they're cost and time effective, meaning you can collect a great amount of data, a vast amount of data, and in short time, and spending very little. So, you know, if it's a survey done by mail, you just have to pay for the stamps, which, you know, can be a lot, but still compared to how much effort and time and money or other resources go into other methods, this is one of the best ones or the strongest ones in this sense. I already mentioned, yeah, you collect a great amount of data as well from a lot of people. That's important to know because that's another strength for case studies, right? That you get a high degree of detail and a lot of information, but about one particular case, whether it be a group or an individual with surveys. When we talk about a vast amount of data, is that not only can people answer many questions quickly, relatively quickly, we're also gaining data from a lot of people. Remember what I said in terms of how size matters in surveys. The larger the sample, the chances or the likelihood of it being representative and therefore its conclusions generalizable. I close my eyes as I say this because I know I've said it many times. It must be so annoying, is much stronger with surveys than with all the other methods. And the problem with surveys is that there is something called a wording effect. And this refers to how the questions are phrased. And you might think that surveys are easy to design, but they're actually not. And wording, phrasing is extremely important. And this is related to the next bullet point on this list of cons for surveys, and is a term that you should know that is called push-pulling. And let me explain it with an example. So perhaps you receive a phone call or read in a survey that has a question that says, does it bother you that automatically your tendency of agreeing to that bother you? Or let's put it this way, we are highly susceptible to this word with a negative connotation that has bother. And this is not push-pulling, by the way. This is the importance, illustrating the importance of the wording of the phrase. This is a question that would have a wording effect. And this wording effect is used for push-pulling. Push-pulling is a political device that is used when a survey is, they present you with a survey, but it's truly not a survey. They just want to convince you of something. It's used a lot in politics. So let's say I'm running for, I don't know, let's say a student is running for student government, right? Student president, president of the student body, and is running against, Bob is running against Bill. And then Bob, as part of his speech, says, does it bother you that, who did I say Bob is running for? Yeah, Bob is running for president. So Bob says, does it bother you that Bill has a reputation of being whatever? So obviously, this question is not, it's almost rhetorical in a sense, this push-pulling strategy in which it seems like it's a question for a survey to ask for an opinion, but it's truly not. It's basically, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, whatever is being phrased here. The goal is simply to plant a doubt over the other candidate or plant a doubt on the other idea. And so basically, it has the form of a survey, but doesn't have the intention of a survey. Let's put it that. That's what push-pulling is. And this is one of the disadvantages of surveys that are commonly used for this. And I was just thinking that Fox News is very good at push-pulling with their interviews. The other problem with the survey is that, think about it. I can guarantee that your parents or the adults with whom you live have piles of mail in a certain place in your home. And much of that mail includes customer service surveys. And what do your parents do with them? They rarely fill them out. And that's the response rate tends to be low with surveys. You can collect a lot of data, but people have to be very creative in order to get people to return the surveys. And still, you can get a sample that is biased because, think about it. If you have, logically, the responses of only people that responded to your survey, that might be a sign of something. That might be an indicator of a particular type of people that is not including the population you intend to study, which also includes people that normally don't respond to surveys. What I'm trying to say is that there might be a personality trait that is different. Perhaps people that respond to surveys are more organized, spend their money in a particular way, and that's different from people who never respond to surveys. So again, that can lead also to a bias, but and that could be a problem with surveys as a research method. And the other one is that there might be topics that are sensitive. I think about drug use or sex practices or behavior that has to do with sexual behavior and contraceptive methods or lack thereof. And people are not very clear who is going to read these responses. Think about it yourself. If you would be completely trusting of the survey itself or the people who are conducting the survey as to they will not know, they will for sure keep your responses anonymous. People can be reluctant to responding them and leading to a bias sample as well. So guys, that's all for now. I hope I tried to be as succinct as possible. Hopefully you listened to this screencast after conducting your reading, and you'll be all set for Tuesday's quiz, and Monday I'll ask you some questions about it. Thank you for your time and patience, guys.